Don't touch that! You don't belong here!" The scream echoed through the marble halls of the Brooks mansion. Isabella stood at the top of the staircase, 13 years old, her voice sharp enough to slice the silence that ruled that house. In her hands, a half-empty glass of juice trembled slightly before she flung it down the stairs. It hit the floor beside Grace Miller's shoes, shattering in a burst of orange and glass. For a moment, everything froze. The housekeepers nearby gasped. One of them whispered, "She's done for now." Grace didn't move. She just looked up, not with anger, not with fear, but with the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable. She slowly reached for a napkin, crouched down, and began wiping the spilled juice. "You think cleaning that will make you look noble?" Isabella spat. "You're just another woman pretending to care because you need my father's money." Grace lifted her head, her gaze steady, unflinching. The kind of gaze that didn't shout back, it revealed. "Money doesn't buy care, Miss Brooks," she said softly. "It just shows who needs to prove they have it." The room went silent again. Even Isabella's lips parted slightly, caught off guard by the calm confidence in that voice. Grace folded the napkin neatly, placed the shards of glass on the tray, and stood. "You'll learn something about me," she continued, voice low but resonant. "I don't work for your father. I work for this home. And right now, it's bleeding anger through its walls." For a split second, Isabella blinked, her arrogance flickering into something else. Confusion. Maybe fear. Maybe curiosity. Then she turned abruptly and stormed upstairs, muttering, "You won't last a week." Grace watched her go, not with resentment, but with that quiet certainty only women who've known deep loss carry. The kind that says, "I've seen worse storms than you." That night when the lights dimmed and the mansion fell back into silence, Grace stood alone in the hall, her reflection in the polished glass whispering a truth she never spoke aloud. "You remind me of her, the daughter I couldn't save." Morning sunlight spilled through the glass walls of the Brooks mansion, but it didn't warm the house. It only exposed how cold it really was. Every surface gleamed, every object was in its place, yet nothing lived there. Grace walked quietly down the hallway, her steps muffled by Persian rugs. She could hear faint sounds, the ticking of an antique clock, the hum of air conditioning, the distant echo of someone typing behind a closed office door. No laughter. No music, no life. At the breakfast table, Isabella sat with her tablet, scrolling without looking up. A single plate waited in front of her, untouched pancakes, fruit perfectly arranged. Across the table, an empty chair. "Your father will be joining you?" Grace asked gently. "He's busy," Isabella said flatly, never lifting her eyes. "He's always busy." Grace smiled faintly, her tone steady. "Even empires need breakfast." Isabella rolled her eyes. "You sound like a book." "Books survive centuries," Grace replied, pouring her a glass of milk. "It's not a bad thing to sound like one." A flicker, the smallest, touched Isabella's face, a twitch between annoyance and curiosity. Just then, heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor. Ethan Brooks entered, phone in hand, suit immaculate, expression detached. He stopped mid-step when he saw Grace standing there, poised, calm, as if she belonged. "You must be the new hire," he said, voice clipped, distracted. "Grace Miller, sir. I prefer Ms. Grace, if that's all right." "My daughter doesn't need another friend," he replied, eyes already back on his phone. "Then it's a good thing I'm not here to be one," she said softly. "I'm here to remind her she already has a father." Ethan froze. For the first time, the air between them felt real. He lowered his phone, his jaw tightening, unsure whether to be offended or impressed. "Do you always speak like that?" "Only when silence stops working," Grace answered. He stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled, a faint, bitter laugh escaping him. "You won't last a week," he echoed his daughter's words. "Then I'll make sure that week counts," Grace said simply. When he walked away, Grace glanced at Isabella, who had stopped scrolling and was now watching her with something new in her eyes. It wasn't respect yet, but it wasn't hatred anymore either. Later that day, as Grace made her rounds through the mansion, she found the music room, covered in dust, silent. A piano sat under a white sheet, like a forgotten ghost. She lifted the fabric. The smell of old wood and memory filled the air. Her fingers brushed the keys. One note rang out, soft, trembling, alive. From the doorway, Isabella whispered, almost to herself, "My mom used to play that." Grace turned, her face kind but serious. "Then maybe it's time someone plays it again." But Isabella didn't move. She just stood there, frozen between grief and defiance. Grace let the silence linger, then gently closed the piano lid. Not today, but someday soon. And as Grace walked away, Isabella touched the piano's edge, for the first time in years. The next morning, Grace entered the living room to find chaos. Juice spilled on the carpet, books scattered across the floor, and crayons broken in half like tiny casualties. Isabella sat on the couch, a smirk tugging at her lips as she watched. "The cleaning supplies are in the kitchen," she said sweetly, without looking up from her phone. "If you hurry, the stain might not set." Grace didn't answer. She simply took in the scene, the deliberate mess, the challenge glinting in those blue eyes, and walked slowly toward the spilled juice. "You missed a spot," Isabella added. "Oh, I noticed," Grace said, kneeling down. "I just prefer cleaning up people before carpets." The girl frowned. "Excuse me?" Grace looked up, eyes calm but piercing. "When someone makes a mess on purpose, it's not the floor that needs attention." For a moment, Isabella didn't know whether to laugh or scream. No one ever spoke to her that way. Not teachers, not staff, not even her father. Grace dipped a cloth in warm water and began to wipe the stain, humming softly. The sound was low, almost like a lullaby. It filled the silence with something that felt human. "You think this is funny?" Isabella asked, voice trembling between anger and confusion. "No," Grace said, "but I think it's sad when someone your age knows how to hurt, but not how to heal." That line hit like a stone dropped in water. The ripples showed in Isabella's face, just a flicker, but it was there. Then, in a flash of pride, she stood up and kicked the bucket over. Water splashed across the polished floor. The other maids gasped. Grace froze, not in fear, but in stillness. She looked at the spreading water, then at the girl standing tall above her, shaking slightly. "Feel better?" Grace asked softly. "You can't talk to me like that," Isabella hissed. Then maybe someone should have started earlier. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that filled a room by its weight, not its volume. For a long, breathless second, the two stared at each other, the spoiled girl trembling with defiance, the woman of strength standing like a quiet storm. Then Grace picked up the empty bucket and said, "I'll be in the kitchen when you're ready to talk like a human being." She walked away, slow, steady, unbothered. Her dignity so absolute, it made the chaos looked childish. Isabella stood there alone, breathing hard. For the first time, she wasn't sure who had won. That evening, Grace found the bucket outside her room, clean, dry, and neatly placed by the door. No note, no words, but a beginning. The next morning, the sound of firm footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. Grace had barely finished setting the breakfast table when Ethan Brooks appeared, jaw tight, tie perfect, phone in hand, irritation radiating off him like heat. "Ms. Miller," he began, his tone clipped, "we need to talk." Grace turned, calm as ever. "Of course, Mr. Brooks. Would you like coffee first or your judgment right away?" He blinked, thrown off by the phrasing. "Excuse me?" "People usually start these talks with an accusation," she said softly. "It saves time to know which part I'm playing." He sighed. "Isabella told me what happened yesterday. The spilled juice, the confrontation. She said you made her feel small." Grace tilted her head. "Did she also tell you she threw the juice first?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "She's 12. You're the adult. You could have handled it differently." Grace nodded slowly. "You're right. I could have ignored it, pretended it didn't happen. That's how she learned it works." That landed. Ethan looked away, jaw flexing. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this, without anger or apology. Grace continued, voice even but steady. "Mr. Brooks, your daughter isn't cruel. She's grieving. And grief left alone becomes arrogance. It's easier to feel powerful than to feel pain." He froze. The words hit too close. "You think you know my family?" he asked quietly. "No," she replied, "but I know what silence does to children. It teaches them that love has conditions." His expression shifted, defensive, uncertain, curious all at once. "You think I don't love my daughter?" "I think you love her," Grace said. "You just forgot how to show it." Silence. A heavy one, thick with truth and pride and everything they didn't say. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders fading just a little. "You speak like a therapist," he muttered. "Once," she said. "But I learned that healing doesn't always need a degree. Sometimes it just needs someone who stays." He studied her, the calm in her posture, the quiet certainty in her eyes. There was something about her that made his polished world feel fragile. "You're different from the others," he said finally. "That's what they all say before the miracle or the mistake," Grace answered with a faint smile. Ethan looked down, almost smiling himself, the first crack in the marble. Then his phone buzzed. The spell broke. "I have a meeting. We'll continue this later." "Of course," Grace said. "But next time, Mr. Brooks, bring breakfast. Even empires need to eat." He stopped mid-step, glanced back at her, and for the first time didn't have a comeback. That night, Grace found a note on the kitchen counter. A simple one, written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for staying. E.B." She smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but in this house, even small gestures were revolutions. It started with a draft, a soft current of air that brushed through the hallway as Grace carried folded linens down the corridor. It made her stop, that kind of pause born not of curiosity but intuition. A door stood slightly open at the far end. No one had entered that room in years. Grace pushed gently, The hinges groaned like an old sigh. Inside, dust motes floated in shafts of light pouring through tall windows. And in the center, covered by a thin white sheet, was a grand piano. She pulled the cloth back, slow and deliberate. The polished black surface caught her reflection, a face of calm, but eyes that had seen too much. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She pressed one. A single note, hesitant, fragile, broke the silence. Behind her, a voice snapped through the still air. "Don't touch that!" Grace turned. Isabella stood in the doorway, fists clenched, eyes flashing. Tears shimmered, but none fell. "That's my mother's," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of memory. "You don't get to touch it." Grace stayed silent, her hand resting lightly on the piano lid. "She used to play every morning," she whispered, "and now it just sits there, like she never existed." "She existed," Grace said softly. "Every sound this piano ever made is still trapped inside it. You just have to set it free again." The girl's jaw tightened. "You think you know anything about her? You don't. You're just—" Her voice broke before the insult could finish. Grace approached, slow enough to give her space. "You're right," she said. "I don't know her, but I can see what she left behind." She gestured gently, not at the piano, but at Isabella herself. "She left you." That hit something raw. Isabella turned away, staring out the window, fighting the tears clawing to escape. Grace stepped closer, her tone steady, anchoring the storm. "You're angry because remembering hurts, but forgetting hurts worse. That's why this room matters." "I hate this room," she whispered. "You hate what it reminds you of. That's not the same thing." A long silence filled the air, the kind that doesn't demand an answer, it simply waits for truth to breathe again. Then from behind them, a new voice, deeper, hesitant. "I didn't know anyone had come in here." Ethan Brooks stood by the door, his expression unreadable. He looked at the piano like a man facing a ghost. "He locked this room after she died. Couldn't stand the sound of it." Grace turned toward him, her voice calm but firm. "You locked a room, Mr. Brooks, not the memory." For a moment, father and daughter stood side by side, both trapped in their own grief, both silent. Grace touched the piano gently, then covered it again. "Some things don't need to be erased. They just need to be played again when you're ready." As she walked out, Isabella stood frozen. Her eyes followed Grace until the door closed softly behind her. Then, with trembling fingers, she lifted the cover again, just enough to press one single key. A sound, thin and broken, filled the room, but it was music again. The rain came early that morning. It tapped softly against the tall windows of the mansion like 1,000 unspoken memories. Grace moved through the quiet halls, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, listening to the rhythm of the storm. Something about it felt like music, unfinished, waiting. She stopped by the library. It was one of the few rooms that still smelled of life, paper, leather, time. She began tidying the shelves when a small ivory envelope slipped from between two old books and floated to the floor. It was yellowed around the edges, sealed with a faded wax mark shaped like a heart. No name on the front, just a single line written in delicate handwriting. "For her, when she's ready to forgive me." Grace's breath caught. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned it over. The seal was unbroken. The handwriting, elegant, feminine, carried a weight of tenderness and regret. She hesitated. This wasn't hers to open, and yet something deep inside told her that letters like this weren't meant to stay silent forever. She brought it to Ethan's office. He looked up from his laptop, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it now?" Grace placed the envelope gently on his desk. "I found this in the library." He frowned. "Probably junk mail." "No," Grace said. "It's her handwriting, isn't it?" Ethan froze. For a moment, his polished composure cracked. He reached for the envelope, but didn't touch it. His fingers hovered over it like someone afraid of fire. "Where did you find it?" he asked quietly. "Behind an old book," Grace said. "It must have been there for years." He leaned back, eyes distant. "I know she wrote letters sometimes. To herself, to Isabella. I didn't have the heart to read them." Grace studied him. There was something raw in his voice, something buried under layers of pride and guilt. "Do you want to give it to her?" Grace asked. "No," he said too quickly. Then softer, "Not yet." Grace nodded. "Then I'll keep it safe until the right moment comes." He looked at her, almost grateful, almost afraid. And who decides that moment? Life does. But life rarely waits for permission. Later that afternoon, Grace found Isabella in the music room, sketching silently. The piano lid was still half open. She watched the girl for a while before speaking. "Your mother loved words," Grace said gently. "Did you know that?" "I don't remember," Isabella murmured. "Dad says talking about her just makes it worse." Grace smiled faintly. "Sometimes silence hurts more than memories ever could." Isabella didn't look up. "You talk like everything can be fixed." "Not everything," Grace said, "but everyone can be healed." The girl finally raised her eyes, wary, curious, and vulnerable. "Even me?" Grace's voice softened. "Especially you." That night, Grace sat by her window, holding the unopened letter. Thunder rolled in the distance, low, steady, alive. She whispered to herself, as if the woman who wrote it could still hear her. "You loved them both so deeply, you left words to finish the love you couldn't." And outside, the storm began to calm. The air in the mansion felt heavy that afternoon, charged, electric, waiting for something to break. Grace sensed it the way seasoned souls sense storms long before they arrive. She was in the kitchen, arranging flowers, wild ones from the garden, when the shout came. "Stop pretending to be her!" Grace turned. Isabella stood in the doorway, her eyes red, hands trembling. Tears glistened, not from sadness, from rage. She clutched the sealed envelope in her hand, crumpled now and wet from her grip. "You went through her things!" she screamed. "You think reading her letters makes you part of this family? You're not my mother!" The housekeepers froze in the background. Grace's eyes flicked to them, and with a small nod, they slipped away, silent witnesses to a storm too intimate for strangers. Grace stepped closer, slow and grounded. "I never wanted to be your mother, Isabella." Her voice was low, steady, unshakable. "Then stop acting like her!" Isabella's voice cracked. "You talk like her, you look at me like she did, you even—" She stopped mid-sentence, choking on her own words. Grace's expression softened, but her voice stayed firm. "I look at you like someone who refuses to give up on you. That's not imitation. That's love." The girl's lip quivered, fury meeting grief, unable to tell them apart. "You don't love me," she said. "You're paid to be here." Grace took a deep breath, not to calm herself, but to center the room. Money doesn't make love. It just pays for its absence. Isabella froze. It was like the words hit a part of her that language had never reached. "You think you can fix me? You think you can fix him?" Grace's eyes softened. "No, I think you both stopped believing you were worth fixing." That broke her. The tears came fast now, like the flood she'd been holding back for years. "She left me," she cried. "She promised she'd be here, and she left me." Grace stepped forward, and for the first time didn't ask permission. She wrapped her arms around her. At first, the girl resisted, fists against Grace's shoulder, body stiff as stone. Then her weight collapsed. The sobs came, shaking, raw, honest. Grace held her tighter, whispering words that sounded more like prayers than comfort. "Your mother didn't leave you, sweetheart. Life did. But love never does. It just waits until you're ready to see it again." Isabella clung to her like someone holding the edge of a cliff. Between sobs, her voice broke into a whisper. "I hate this house." "Then we'll teach it to love again, one room at a time," Grace murmured. From the hallway, Ethan watched, motionless, speechless. Something inside him cracked too. For the first time in years, he saw his daughter cry. And for the first time in years, it didn't sound like weakness. It sounded like healing. That night, Grace found the envelope on the kitchen counter, opened now, carefully folded, no longer wet. Next to it, a small note in shaky handwriting. She wrote that she loved me. I believe it now. I.B. Grace smiled softly, pressing the letter to her chest. "Then maybe you're ready," she whispered. Outside, the rain had stopped. The mansion, once hollow, exhaled. It happened just before midnight. Grace had fallen asleep on the couch in the study, a book half open on her chest. Outside, a summer storm raged, wind rattling the windows, thunder rolling across the hills. Then came a faint crackling sound, soft at first, then hungry. She woke to the smell of smoke. Within seconds, her calm turned to focus. No panic, just motion. Years of discipline living in her body like instinct. She stepped into the hallway, smoke curling from under a door halfway down. Isabella's room. Grace ran. The door handle burned her palm. She wrapped her hand in a curtain and forced it open. Inside, flames crawled up one side of the drapes, licking toward the ceiling. Isabella was coughing, eyes wide with fear, frozen on the bed. "Isabella!" Grace's voice cut through the roar. "Come to me, now!" The girl didn't move. She was shaking, choking on smoke. Grace grabbed a blanket, threw it over the flames, and charged through the heat. She reached the bed, wrapped her arms around Isabella, and pulled her close. "Breathe through me," she whispered. "We're walking out together." Step by step, through the smoke, through the fear. Grace shielded her with her own body, her own breath, her own calm. They burst into the hallway just as Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, panic written across his face. "Isabella!" he shouted. The moment his eyes met Grace's, her clothes scorched, her arms still around his daughter, time stopped. "She's safe," Grace said, her voice raw but steady. "You need to get everyone out, now!" He nodded, shouting orders down the hall. Grace turned, ushering Isabella toward the front door as the house alarms finally blared to life. Outside, the night was chaos. Rain, sirens, firelight flickering through the windows. Ethan ran out behind them, grabbing his daughter, holding her close, trembling with relief. "I thought you lost you," he whispered. "You almost did," she said, her voice shaking. "But she didn't let me go." Grace stood a few feet away, soaked from the rain, breathing hard. Her face illuminated by the orange glow of the burning wing of the mansion. Even through the smoke and chaos, she looked serene. A firefighter approached. "Everyone out?" "Yes," Grace answered. "Everyone who matters." Hours later, after the fire was contained, Ethan found her sitting on the steps outside, wrapped in a blanket. He sat beside her, silent for a while, watching the embers fade. "You went back in," he said finally. "Of course," she replied. "She was still inside." "You could have died. Then it would have meant something." He turned to her, eyes full of disbelief and gratitude. "You're not just a housekeeper, are you?" Grace smiled faintly. "No, Mr. Brooks, I'm the reminder that homes aren't built from walls. They're built from people brave enough to stay." The next morning, as the sun rose over the smoking ruins of the east wing of the mansion, Isabella sat beside Grace, wrapped in the same blanket. She leaned against her shoulder, quiet, safe. "I thought everything would burn," she whispered. "It did," Grace said softly. "Everything that needed to." And for the first time, the house felt warm again. The night after the fire, the mansion was quieter than ever. The east wing lay dark and hollow, the scent of smoke still floating in the air, a haunting reminder of what could have been lost. Grace sat in the library, the same place where she had found the letter. Her hands rested around a cup of tea gone cold. The room was still until Ethan entered. He looked different now. No suit, no tie. Just a man who had finally run out of walls to hide behind. "She's sleeping," he said softly. "Good," Grace replied. "Sleep is how the soul restarts after fear." He gave a faint smile, weary but real. "I owe you her life." "You owe her your attention," Grace said. "That's harder to give than gratitude." He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, searching her face. "You talk like you've lived through wars." "I have," she said quietly. "Just not the kind you see on TV." There was a pause, a stillness that asked for honesty. "Grace," he said, hesitating, "who are you, really?" She looked down at her tea, and then met his eyes. "A woman who used to have a daughter." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Used to?" he repeated. She nodded slowly. "Her name was Maya, bright, stubborn, just like Isabella. She was 12 when I lost her. A car accident. I was late picking her up from school. It rained that day too." Ethan froze, his breath caught, his expression softening. Grace's voice stayed steady, but her eyes glistened. "After that, I couldn't stand being in my own house. Every sound felt like an accusation. So I started working, cleaning other people's homes, because I didn't know how to live in mine anymore." Silence filled the room. Not pity, reverence. "You don't have to," Ethan began, but she stopped him with a raised hand. "It's all right. Pain shared is pain remembered, not relived." She took a deep breath. "When I met Isabella, I saw the same anger Maya used to have when she thought I wasn't listening. But underneath, there's just a child who misses being held." Ethan's voice broke slightly. "I've failed her." "No," Grace said softly. "You paused her. You put love on hold because grief was too loud. But she waited. Children always wait." He leaned back, his eyes glistening. "You've came here to save her." "No," Grace said, shaking her head. "I came here because saving her might save me." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the quiet crackle of the fireplace filled the air, warm, forgiving. Ethan finally whispered, "You've done more for us in weeks than I've managed in years." Grace smiled faintly. "You don't fix people, Mr. Brooks. You love them until they remember they were never broken." From the hallway, unseen, Isabella stood listening. Tears streamed silently down her face. For the first time, she understood who Grace really was and why her love felt so familiar. She whispered to herself, "That's why she never gave up on me." And outside, the first light of dawn began to break through the smoke-stained windows, soft, golden, like forgiveness itself. The house was different now. You could feel it before you saw it, a softness in the air, a rhythm in the quiet. The halls, once filled with echoes, now carried traces of life. The faint sound of piano keys, the smell of coffee and toast, the distant hum of conversation. Grace walked through the living room, her steps unhurried. The sun poured through the wide windows, painting gold across the floor. On the couch, Isabella sat with a sketchbook in her lap, drawing something Grace couldn't quite see yet. "What are you working on?" Grace asked, leaning over gently. "It's the house," Isabella said shyly, "but not how it looks now, how it feels." Grace smiled, her voice warm. "And how does it feel?" "Like it's finally breathing again," Isabella answered. A pause. Then, softly, "I think Mom would like you." Grace's smile faltered, not from pain, but from gratitude. "Then maybe we're both finally learning how to like ourselves again." That afternoon, the three of them gathered in the music room. The walls had been repainted. Sunlight now danced across the polished piano. Grace stood by while Isabella sat at the keys, fingers trembling but determined. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching, hands in his pockets, eyes soft. "It's been years since anyone played that," he said quietly. "Then let's not waste another," Grace replied. The first notes were hesitant, fragile, but Grace began humming softly beside her. And somehow, Isabella's rhythm steadied. The melody filled the room, graceful and alive, like something sacred had returned home. When the song ended, Ethan wiped a tear from his cheek, quick, almost embarrassed. Grace caught the gesture and smiled. "It's all right. Strong men cry too. They just call it remembering." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're impossible." "No, just inevitable." That evening they had dinner together for the first time, not in silence, but with laughter. Ethan told a story about the time he burned pancakes trying to impress his wife. Isabella giggled, covering her mouth. Grace added, "Well, at least now we know it runs in the family." Laughter, real, loud, and unashamed, filled the room. For the first time, it sounded like home. After dinner, as the sky turned violet, Grace stepped outside to breathe the night air. Ethan joined her, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. "No, I just reminded you it could change." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not obligation, something deeper. Respect, gratitude, connection. "What will you do when all this is fixed?" he asked. Grace smiled faintly. "Healing doesn't end, Mr. Brooks. It just moves to a new address." They stood there in silence, 2 souls who had lost and found different kinds of love, watching the stars rise over a house that finally had a heartbeat again. Inside, Isabella played softly on the piano, the same song her mother once loved. And for the first time, the music didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like memory, like love that stayed. Morning sunlight poured through the glass walls, painting the mansion in gold. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the halls, mingling with the faint sound of the piano, Isabella's hands now confident, graceful. Grace stood by the staircase, suitcase beside her. She was dressed simply, her posture calm, the same quiet dignity she carried from the first day. Only now her presence meant something to everyone inside that house. Ethan entered first. He stopped when he saw the suitcase. "You're leaving," he said, though it came out more like a question. Grace smiled softly. It's time. The house doesn't need me anymore." "That's not true," he said, voice low. "We do." She shook her head gently. "No, Mr. Brooks, you did, but now you've remembered how to stay." He looked down, his throat tightening. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did. You listened." From the hallway, Isabella appeared, her sketchbook pressed to her chest. She walked up to Grace slowly, trying to be brave. "You can't go," she said, her voice trembling. Grace knelt, meeting her eyes. "Sweetheart, I was never meant to stay. My job was to make sure you could feel safe again, even when people leave." A tear rolled down Isabella's cheek. "But you're not people. You're Grace." Grace smiled through her own tears. "Then remember this. Grace isn't something you lose. It's something you grow into." Isabella threw her arms around her, holding on tightly. Grace hugged her back, breathing in the scent of childhood and hope. When they finally let go, Isabella handed her the sketchbook. "I drew something for you." Grace opened it. On the page, a beautiful drawing. The mansion bathed in sunlight, laughter flowing through the windows, and 3 figures standing together at the piano. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, "You gave our house a heart again." Grace closed the book, pressing it to her chest. "Then I can leave knowing my work is done." At the door, Ethan stood waiting. The sunlight framed him, softer now, no longer the cold shadow of ambition. "You're remarkable, Grace. You saved more than a home." "No," she replied gently. "I just reminded you both how to live inside one." He hesitated. "Will we ever see you again?" Grace smiled faintly, eyes shimmering. "If you ever forget how strong you are, look for the sunrise. That's where I'll be." She turned, suitcase in hand, and walked out into the golden morning. The wind caught her scarf, lifting it slightly, like a soft farewell from the universe itself. Inside, Isabella ran to the window, watching her disappear down the path. "She's gone," she whispered. Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder. "No," he said softly. "She's everywhere now." They stood together, watching the horizon. Then, from the piano behind them, a single note played, the same one Grace had touched on her first day. The sound lingered in the air, alive, eternal, full of meaning. And in that moment, the house was no longer silent. It was home. She didn't just clean a house. She cleared the dust from 2 hearts and left the light to stay.